In this episode, I'm going to be talking about some personal struggles I had this year and how they ultimately led to the most important book I've ever written. I'm Michael Laron, and this is the Writer's Journey podcast, where you get a window into the life of a working science fiction and fantasy author. I'm on a mission to go from nobody to bestseller, and I'm documenting every step of the way. Tune in every week as I share my progress and discover what inspires my books and how I write them. You can find the show notes for today's episode at michaellaron.com/podcast. This week, I'm talking about the writing life. Hello there, welcome to episode 5 of the podcast. This time, I want to talk about a life-changing experience that shaped me as a writer. It's April 2018 as I record this, and it happened earlier in the year. This experience is about my biological father. My parents divorced when I was young. I never knew my father, and from what I've learned, he never wanted to know me. In early 2018, I decided to try to find him. I had a lot of questions, and to be honest with you, I wasn't brave enough to search him out until then. Growing up, I was angry. I was just angry that he didn't want to be around. Really angry. But now was different. I had a 3-year-old, and I knew what it meant to be a good father. I'd learned some important life lessons. I mellowed out, so I just wanted to understand. On a complete whim, I found him on Facebook. I spent hours on his profile looking at his posts and all the things that had been happening in his life, and he'd aged quite a bit. He had remarried, and he was living in Florida. He looked happy. It took me 2 days to muster up the courage to send him a friend request on Facebook with a short message that I was his son and that I wanted to connect. He ignored my request. I knew deep down that there was always a possibility of rejection, but I wasn't actually prepared for it. This shook me to my core, and I wasn't myself for days. I had to come to the fact that my father had abandoned me. I had never actually accepted it before. I just compartmentalized it, pushed these feelings deeper inside myself with the hopes that one day they might disappear. I had suppressed these feelings for my entire life, loneliness, inadequacy, anger, but I never knew that abandonment issues were what they were actually called. Not once did it ever occur to me that these feelings weren't normal. Forgiveness came unnaturally to me, and I had to back into it, but I did forgive my father. But let me tell you about something that I'm still struggling with. I learned that my father's sister lived only a few miles away from my childhood neighborhood. She even taught in my school district. I probably saw her many times and never knew who she was, but she probably would have known who I was. Growing up, I'd always thought that my father's mother, my grandmother, died when I was young. I don't remember why, I just had always had this idea in my head that that's what had happened. It turned out that she died only a few months prior to me reaching out to my father. Now, I've been blessed with 2 amazing grandmothers growing up. Both were like mothers to me. So to realize that I had a grandmother who didn't want a connection with me was really hard. It went against everything I knew to be true of what a grandmother should be. I could take my father. I could even take my aunt, but I just couldn't take my grandmother. I remember reading her obituary online and thinking to myself that it's irrational that I would be more upset over the passing of a grandmother that I never knew than the fact that my own father had abandoned me. I couldn't shake the emotions. There's just heavy energy I feel every time I think of her. It's so powerful that it usually takes my breath away. I don't know what it means, but I don't feel this energy when I think of my father, and that's why it bothers me. I keep thinking that if I only had reached out sooner, maybe things would be different. But at the same time, I'm grateful that my life turned out the way it did. I've been blessed with an amazing mother and maternal grandparents, and an incredible stepdad who filled the void that my father left behind. But I can't ignore these emotions that I feel, and I've learned to cope with them. There's a silver lining to this story, I promise. I've always had this notion that I'm going to do really well in life, and I'm going to be wildly successful in spite of my father, just to show him that I didn't need him. I used that to overcompensate for the fact that I had abandonment issues. This experience taught me that I am who I am, and that, in and of itself, is enough. I don't need to prove anything to anyone, not even to myself. But spiritually, I had to heal. And that's when I rediscovered something that I've known all my life but somehow forgotten during this whole exchange. Writing is how I heal. It's how I deal with life's problems. It's me figuring out how to deal with the world through my stories. When my father rejected me for the second time, writing was the religion I turned to heal. My wife and I had a long spiritual talk about this, about my father and about my writing, and we talked about my creative well and how it's always full. I never run out of ideas. And she said something that I'll never forget. She said, "It's not enough to fill your well if you don't use it to help other people." I started thinking about that. After all, at this point in my career, I was publishing 10 to 12 books a year, which is something that most writers only dream of. I was doing this with a full-time job, no doubt. How could I share what I learned about writing with other people so that they could improve their careers? Again, of course, I knew all this all along, and of course I've always wanted to help people with my career. Like I said, during this exchange, it just messed me up so much that I wasn't thinking properly. That's why I wrote my book, Be a Writing Machine. It was the exact book I needed to write at this point in my life. In it, I talk about my father and my life, so on one hand it's therapy. On the other hand, I talk about how I've learned to be prolific over the years in spite of difficulties. It felt really good to write the book, and I did it purely to help other people. I don't care if I never make any money for it. If it helps just one person or a couple of people, then it did its job. That book was my way of sending out some positive energy into the universe to compensate for the negative energy I felt from the experience with my father. As we come to the end of this week's show, I'd like to share the book with you. Here's a clip from the audiobook version of Be a Writing Machine, narrated by John Fryer.
Books help people. They help us expand our minds and be better people. So I know that when I'm writing, I'm helping others too. I'm helping that guy who comes home from work every day and likes to escape into a good book. I'm helping the woman who reads for adventure and thrill. And that, in and of itself, is enough for me. I am prolific because I have connected completely with the reason I was put on this earth. I'm prolific because the experiences of my life have allowed me to remove all fear and therefore work harder and faster than I ever thought possible. I fear nothing and no one. I just sit down and I make stuff up, trusting that my work is making a difference in people's lives. Nothing fills my spiritual and creative well like writing. Thinking about the next story is what gets me out of bed in the morning every day. Not marketing, not money, not being famous. Just doing the work is enough for me. How about you?
You can pick up a copy of Be a Writing Machine at michaelaron.com/beawritingmachine. Thanks for joining me this week. If you enjoyed the show, here are a couple ways to help a brother out. If you're listening to this on Anchor, favorite the show. If you're listening to this on a podcast app, do me a favor and write me a review and share it with your friends. You can, of course, visit my website and learn more about my work at michaelaron.com. If you have a question, send me a voice message on Anchor and you just might hear it on the show. Next week, I'll be reading a page from my writer's sketchbook. Until then, I leave you with a quote. Forgiveness is not always easy. At times, it feels more painful than the wound we suffered to forgive the one that inflicted it. And yet, there is no peace without forgiveness. Marianne Williamson.